Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on something we've all experienced, learning a new language. We're going to dig into the secret history of how we're taught, from those super old school textbooks to what's happening in classrooms right now, and maybe figure out why sometimes it works and why sometimes it really, really doesn't. Does this feel familiar? You've spent, years drilling vocabulary, memorizing grammar rules, but the moment you actually need to have a simple, real-world conversation, you just freeze. Well, listen to this. The reason for that might have way less to do with you and a whole lot more to do with how you were taught. So, to really get what's happening now, we have to go back, way back. We need to look at the very foundation of language education. And for a long, long time, that foundation was built on some pretty, let's call them old school rules. Okay, meet the undisputed champion for over a century, the grammar translation method. And really, its name tells you everything. It wasn't designed to help you chat with someone in Paris. Nope. It was designed to study dead languages, like Latin and ancient Greek. It treated language like a code that you had to decipher, not a tool for conversation. And here's the absolute key. Speaking was never, ever the goal. The whole point was mental gymnastics. Language was a logic puzzle. The entire process was about breaking down sentences, figuring out the grammar, and then translating them word for word. It was about training your brain, not your tongue. And this is just a perfect illustration of how disconnected it all was. I mean, look at these example sentences from old textbooks. You've got, the philosopher pulled the lower jaw of the duke. And my personal favorite, the cat of my aunt is more treacherous than the dog of your uncle. You can just see, these were written only to show a grammar rule. Nobody was ever supposed to actually say these things out loud. Well, as you can imagine, people eventually got a little tired of just learning how to describe their aunt's treacherous cat. A rebellion started brewing, a shift in thinking that would become a full-blown speaking revolution. I know, it sounds almost silly to us now, right? But you have to understand, at the time, this was a radical idea. A bunch of reformers across Europe started to push back, saying, hey, wait a minute. What if the whole point of learning a modern language was to, communicate? And this pushback led to a totally new philosophy, which got called the direct method. And wow, the difference is night and day. Forget reading and writing. The new focus was all on speaking and listening. Translation? Forbidden. Using your native language in class? Banned. The idea was to immerse yourself, to just dive right in. You had these amazing innovators, like this guy, Francois Gouin. He tried to copy how little kids learn their first language. So he came up with something called the Gouin series, where you tied language to a set of physical actions. So you wouldn't just memorize words, you'd learn a sequence like, I walk toward the door, I stop at the door, I take the handle. You were connecting language to doing something. So the new rules of the game were pretty simple. Everything happens in the language you're trying to learn. You build up your speaking skills with a ton of questions and answers. And grammar, you learn it inductively, which is just a fancy way of saying you figure out the rules from examples, like a detective, instead of memorizing them. It was a massive change. Now, these theories are all well and good, but how do they actually work in the real world? In an entire country's school system? To see that in action, we're going to look at a really fantastic test case. We're going to zoom in on Turkey because its story is a perfect example of how language education is never just about learning words. It's about geopolitics, economics, and what a country wants to be on the world stage. Turkey's ambition to join NATO and later the European Union had a direct impact on which languages were taught and how they were taught. So here's a quick flyover. For a long time, if you were part of the elite, French was the language to know. But after the Turkish Republic was founded, and especially after joining NATO in '52, English starts to elbow its way in. And then, bam, the 1980s hit. Globalization goes into overdrive, and suddenly English isn't just for diplomats, it's for everyone. And if you want to see just how fast that change was, check out this number. In 1987, you have 193 high schools in Turkey teaching in English. Fast forward just 2 decades, to 2007, and that number has exploded to over 1,100. That is not a gradual shift. That is a tidal wave of demand. And this quote just nails the pressure behind those numbers. Sine qua non, it's a Latin phrase that basically means something you absolutely cannot do without. English wasn't a nice-to-have skill anymore. It was seen as a ticket to a successful life, and parents were scrambling to make sure their kids got it. But here's where the story gets really interesting. As Turkey officially embraced these modern new ideas for teaching language, it slammed right into a problem that pretty much every education system faces: the giant gap between the plan on paper and what actually happens in a real classroom. So in 1997, the country launched this huge, ambitious reform. It was a big deal. The government officially said, okay, we're doing it. We're adopting the communicative approach. The dream was to finally get Turkish students to a point where they could actually have a conversation in English. But there was this huge disconnect. The policy was all about active, student-led learning, but the reality in most schools? It still looked really traditional. Teachers were mostly lecturing from the front of the room, drilling grammar, kind of like the old grammar translation method they were trying to escape. The vision just wasn't making it into practice. So why? What happened? Well, it came down to some very practical real-world problems. The curriculum was just too much to get through. There weren't enough class hours. You had huge class sizes. I mean, trying to do group activities with 40 students? Good luck. And a lot of the time, the textbooks just weren't designed for this new way of teaching. The whole system was still set up for the old way. And that brings us to today, because this story, of course, isn't finished. The debate, the evolution, it's all still happening. So the question is, what's next? Where are we headed? This push for a better way to teach languages is always moving. In Turkey, the goal of aligning with European Union standards keeps the pressure on for more reforms. And, for all of us, new technology is completely changing the game, forcing us to ask what a classroom even is anymore. And we're starting to see a few big ideas really take the lead. There's a huge focus now on learner autonomy, basically giving you the tools to take control of your own learning journey. We're also moving away from just test scores and towards things like portfolios, which can actually show what you can do with a language over time. It's all becoming much more practical and interconnected. Which leaves us with a final and, I think, pretty profound question for right now. In a world where you have AI in your pocket that can translate a conversation in real time, what does it even mean to learn a language anymore? Is the goal still fluency? Is it about cultural connection? Or is it something else entirely? As this whole secret history shows us, the answer to that question is always, always changing.